The train lurched to a stop at Presidio, Texas, and Penelope Foster pressed her gloved hand against the faded yellow bruise on her ribs, willing herself not to wince as she stood. It was September 1882, and the desert heat rolled through the open windows like the breath of something living and merciless. But she welcomed it because it meant distance, miles and miles between her and the man whose fists had painted her skin in shades of purple and green for 3 long years. She descended the steps carefully, her worn carpet bag clutched in one hand, her other hand steadying herself against the hot metal railing. The platform was nearly empty except for a weathered station agent and a tall man in dusty denims who stood with his hat in his hands, dark hair falling across his forehead. He was watching the train with an expression somewhere between hope and terror, and Penelope's stomach dropped because she knew that look. She had worn it herself when she had married Gerald 3 years ago in Boston, back when she still believed love could be gentle. The man's eyes found hers and something shifted in his face. Not disappointment, which she had braced herself for, but something softer. Relief, maybe. He stepped forward and she noticed he moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. "Miss Foster." His voice was deep but careful, like he was afraid of startling a wild horse. Yes, her own voice came out steadier than she felt. "Mr. Yates." "Zachary Yates, madam. Most folks just call me Zach." He reached for her bag and she flinched before she could stop herself, pulling it closer to her body. His hand froze in midair and his dark eyes met hers with an understanding that made her chest tighten. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hand and took a step back. "I can walk alongside you if you would rather carry it yourself." The kindness in those words, the space he offered without question, made her eyes burn. She blinked quickly and nodded. "Thank you." They walked in silence down the dusty main street of Presidio, past the saloon where piano music drifted through swinging doors, past the general store with its painted sign promising dry goods and provisions, past the marshal's office where 2 men sat on chairs tilted back against the wall. The sun beat down relentlessly and sweat gathered under Penelope's high collar, but she did not loosen it. Could not. Zachary's ranch was 3 miles outside town and he had brought a wagon. He helped her up onto the seat with the same careful distance, never touching her unless necessary, always telegraphing his movements. The wagon bed held supplies, flour and sugar and coffee beans, and the whole thing smelled like hay and leather, and something clean she could not name. "The ranch is not much," he said as they rolled out of town, the horses' hooves kicking up pale dust. "But it is mine, paid for fair and square. Got about 200 head of cattle, some horses. A house that needs a woman's touch, I will not lie about that." Penelope studied his profile. He was probably 30, maybe 32, with strong features and sun-weathered skin. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pale against his tan. "Why did you send for a mail-order bride, Mr. Yates?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the reins. "Took a bullet in the leg 2 years back. Rustlers hit the ranch and I was stupid enough to try to stop them alone. Doc said I was lucky I did not lose the leg entirely. Healed up fine, mostly, but it aches when the weather turns. Made me think about what would happen if something worse came along and there was no one to know or care." He glanced at her briefly. "Gets lonely out here. Figured it was time to stop being alone. You could have courted someone local." "Could have," he nodded. "But the women in town, they have known me since I was a boy stealing apples from old Mrs. Henderson's tree. Hard to see a man as a husband when you remember him with a black eye from falling out of that same tree. Besides, I wanted someone who was choosing this life deliberately, not just settling because I was convenient." Penelope turned that over in her mind. She had chosen this deliberately too, though her reasons were darker than his. The advertisement had been simple. Rancher seeks respectable woman for marriage, must be hardworking and honest, will provide home and security. When she had written back, her hands had shaken so hard she could barely hold the pen. She had not told him about Gerald. about the accident that had freed her but left her with nothing but bruises and nightmares. The marriage certificate she had included had been real enough, and so had the death certificate, signed by a Boston physician 6 months ago. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a sprawling collection of buildings in shades of brown and gray. The house was adobe, squat and solid against the harsh landscape, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front. Beyond it stood a barn, a bunkhouse, several corrals, and a windmill that spun lazily in the hot breeze. It was rough and weathered, but there was something honest about it that made Penelope's throat tighten. "The hands are out with the herd," Zachary said as he helped her down, careful to release her the moment her feet touched the ground. "Cook's in the bunkhouse making dinner for everyone. Figured you and I could eat at the house, give you time to settle in." The inside of the house was dim and cool, the thick adobe walls keeping out the worst of the heat. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with mismatched chairs, and a pair of armchairs that had seen better days. Everything was clean but spare, functional rather than comfortable. "There are 2 bedrooms," Zachary said, setting her bag down near a doorway. "You can take the larger one, I will use the other." Penelope turned to stare at him. 2 bedrooms? His ears went red, but he met her eyes steadily. "Yes, madam. I figured we could get to know each other a bit before anything else. If you are agreeable to that." Something cracked open in her chest, something that had been locked tight since the first time Gerald's hand had connected with her face. "I would be agreeable to that." "Good." He cleared his throat. "I will get some water heating so you can wash up. The reverend in town said he could perform the ceremony tomorrow afternoon if that suits you. No pressure, though. If you need more time, we can wait. Tomorrow is fine." She needed the legal protection of marriage, needed the security of being Mrs. Zachary Yates instead of the widow of Gerald Foster. But more than that, she found she wanted to repay this man's kindness with honesty, even if she could not give him the whole truth yet. "Mr. Yates, I need to tell you something." "Zach," he corrected gently. "Zach." The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her nervous. "My first marriage was not happy, I wanted you to know that." His expression did not change, but something flickered in his dark eyes. "I am sorry to hear that. A man who does not treat his wife with respect is no man at all. You say that easily." "Because I mean it." He held her gaze. "My pa raised me and my brother alone after our ma died, worked himself to the bone to keep us fed and clothed. I watched him come in exhausted every night, hands bleeding sometimes from hard work, but he never once raised his voice to us out of anger. Never raised a hand. He said a real man's strength is in how gentle he can be, not how much damage he can do." His jaw tightened. "I try to live by that." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes and looked away quickly. "That is a good way to live. I hope so." He moved toward the door, giving her space again. "I will get that water, you rest a bit. We eat around 6. After he left, Penelope sank into one of the armchairs and let herself shake. The journey had taken 3 days, 3 days of looking over her shoulder even though she knew Gerald was dead, buried in a Boston cemetery with a headstone paid for by his brother. The official story was that he had fallen down the stairs in a drunken stupor and broken his neck. The truth was more complicated. Penelope had pushed him, finally, after 3 years of taking his blows, had planted her hands on his chest as he came at her with rage in his eyes and shoved with every ounce of strength she possessed. The stairs had done the rest. She had told the police it was an accident, and they had believed her because Gerald had been well known for his drinking. His brother had believed her too, or at least had not cared enough to question it. She had lived with the guilt and the relief in equal measure for 6 months before finding Zachary's advertisement. She had known she could not stay in Boston, could not keep living in the house where Gerald's ghost seemed to lurk in every corner. So she had packed what little she owned and bought a train ticket west, toward a new life with a stranger who wrote about loneliness instead of love. The water Zachary brought was hot and plentiful, and he had even included a bar of lavender soap. Penelope washed in the bedroom he had given her, careful of the bruises that were finally starting to fade. The worst was on her ribs, a sprawling yellow and green thing from where Gerald had kicked her in one of their final fights. There were smaller ones on her upper arms, hidden by her sleeves, and a fading mark on her collarbone. She was lucky, she supposed. Lucky he had died before he could do worse. Lucky she had found the strength to push him. Lucky this cowboy in Texas had been lonely enough to send for a wife. Dinner was simple. Beef stew with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and coffee so strong it made her eyes water. They ate in silence for a while, the quiet comfortable rather than awkward. Zachary ate with the efficient motions of a man used to fueling his body rather than enjoying his food, but he had set the table carefully, put out cloth napkins, and filled her water glass to the brim. "Tell me about the ranch," she said finally. He looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Started it 5 years ago with money I saved working as a ranch hand for the Triple Bar spread north of here. Bought the land cheap because the water rights were disputed, but I got that sorted out. Built the house and barn myself, hired on 3 hands to help with the cattle. We run mostly longhorns, drive them up to the railhead in Abilene once a year. It is hard work, but it is mine. Do you enjoy it? Most days." He smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger. "I like being outside, like working with the animals. Cattle can be stubborn and stupid, but they are honest about it. A cow is not going to smile at you while planning something mean." Penelope thought of Gerald's charm, the way he had courted her with flowers and poetry, how quickly that charm had turned to cruelty. "I appreciate honesty." "Then we should get along fine." He pushed back from the table and stood, gathering the dishes. "I will clean these, you should rest. It has been a long day. I can help. I know you can." He met her eyes. "But you do not have to, not tonight." She watched him carry the dishes to the basin near the stove, watched him roll up his sleeves and set to work with practiced efficiency. There was something mesmerizing about it, the way his hands moved, the way he hummed under his breath. It was so different from what she had known that it made her chest ache. That night, lying in the narrow bed in her new room, Penelope listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied. The wind rattled the shutters. In the room next to hers, she could hear Zachary moving around, the creak of bed springs as he lay down. She waited for anxiety to rise, for the old familiar fear of what might happen in the dark, but it did not come. Instead, she felt something like peace, fragile and new as a bird's egg, and she carried it with her into sleep. The wedding took place the next afternoon in the small adobe church on the edge of Presidio. The reverend was a thin man with kind eyes who did not ask questions about the speed of the ceremony. Zachary had bought her a simple gold band that fit perfectly, and he slid it onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. She wore the same gray dress she had traveled in, but she had pinned her dark hair up with care, and Zachary had told her she looked beautiful in a voice that made her believe he meant it. "I do," she said when the reverend asked, and her voice was steady. "I do," Zachary echoed, and then he was her husband and she was his wife, and they walked out of the church into the bright September sunlight as Mr. and Mrs. Yates. They ate dinner that night at the hotel restaurant, a celebration of sorts. Zachary ordered steak and potatoes for both of them and a slice of apple pie to share. He talked about his plans for the ranch, about wanting to buy more land to the south, about breeding better horses. Penelope listened and asked questions, and slowly, gradually, she began to relax. This man was not Gerald. He did not drink to excess, did not watch her with calculation in his eyes. When he laughed at something she said, it was genuine, open. "What about you?" he asked as they walked back to the wagon in the gathering dusk. "What did you do in Boston?" "I worked as a seamstress for a time," she said, which was true. She had needed the money after Gerald lost his job for showing up drunk. "I am good with a needle. That will be useful. I swear I spend half my life mending torn shirts." He helped her up onto the wagon seat, and this time his touch lingered for just a moment, warm and solid. "What else do you like to do?" "I like to read when I can get books. I like cooking, baking especially. I like gardens, though I never had much success with them in the city." "There is space for a garden here. Might need to rig up some irrigation, but it could work." He sounded thoughtful. "We could try it in the spring." The words sent a little shiver through her. It had been a long time since she had been part of a we that did not feel like a trap. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Zachary woke before dawn to work with the cattle, and Penelope rose with him to make breakfast. She cooked and cleaned and began to organize the house. Hanging curtains she sewed from fabric Zachary bought at the general store, scrubbing floors until they gleamed. He came in for lunch smelling of horse and leather, always dirty, always tired. But he never failed to thank her for the meal or ask about her day. They were careful with each other, polite, dancing around the edges of intimacy. He still slept in the smaller bedroom, and she was grateful for it, even as part of her began to wonder what it might be like to share a bed with this gentle man. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something hungry and tender at once, but he always looked away quickly, gave her space. 2 weeks after the wedding, she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she reached up too quickly and pain lanced through her ribs. She gasped and pressed a hand to her side, and when she pulled her hand away, there was blood on her fingers. The nearly healed bruise had split, just a little but enough to stain her dress. "Penelope?" She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Zachary stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his face creased with concern. She had not heard him approach. "It is nothing," she said quickly, lowering her hand. "I just moved wrong, you are bleeding." He took a step closer, then stopped. "Will you let me look?" "No," the word came out too sharp, too fast, his eyes narrowed, not with anger but with understanding. "Please, I am worried." She hesitated, her pulse hammering. Then, slowly, she nodded. He moved closer, his movements careful and deliberate, and she lifted the edge of her blood-stained dress to show him the bruise on her ribs. It was mostly yellow now, weeks old, but the center had split where the skin was still fragile. Zachary's face went very still. He did not touch her, but she saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. "Your first husband did this." It was not a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes." "How many times?" "Too many to count." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they were bright with something fierce. "I am glad he is dead." The bluntness of it startled a laugh out of her, bitter and small. "So am I. Come inside, let me clean that up." He offered his hand, palm up, and after a moment she took it. His grip was warm and firm, and he led her into the house with a gentleness that made her want to cry. He sat her down at the kitchen table and brought out a clean cloth, a basin of water, and the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. "This might sting. I have had worse." His jaw tightened, but he just nodded and set to work cleaning the small wound. His hands were steady, careful, and he talked while he worked, his voice low and soothing. "My brother, he married a woman a few years back. Sweet girl, always smiling. Then we started noticing she wore high collars even in summer, always had an excuse for why she could not visit. Turned out her husband was mean when he drank. My brother and we paid him a visit one night, explained that if he ever touched her again, we would make sure he regretted it. Did it work? He tried to pull a gun on us. I broke his arm. My brother broke his jaw. He never touched her again." Zachary finished cleaning the wound and sat back, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I am not a violent man, Penelope, but I believe in protecting people who cannot protect themselves." "I protected myself," she said quietly. In the end, his expression shifted and she saw the moment he understood. "Good, that took more courage than anything I have ever done." The tears came then, hot and fast, and she could not stop them. Zachary pulled his chair closer and took her hands in his, holding them gently while she cried. He did not tell her to stop, did not tell her it would be all right. He just held her hands and waited, and when the tears finally slowed, he offered her a clean handkerchief. I am sorry, she said, wiping her eyes. Do not be. You have been carrying that alone for too long. He hesitated, then reached up and carefully, slowly, pushed a strand of hair back from her face. I meant what I said in my vows. I will honor and protect you. That does not just mean from other people. It means from me too. I will never raise a hand to you, Penelope. Never. Then let me be the one who never raises a hand, she whispered, and the words felt like a confession and a plea at once. His thumb brushed her cheek, catching a stray tear. You already are. Something shifted between them after that day. The careful distance remained, but there was a new understanding beneath it, a foundation they were building together. Zachary began to linger at breakfast, asking about her plans for the day, telling her stories about the ranch hands or the cattle. Penelope began to touch him in small ways, a hand on his shoulder when she poured his coffee, her fingers brushing his when she handed him his hat. One evening, 3 weeks after the wedding, she found him sitting on the porch in the twilight, his bad legs stretched out in front of him. She brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside him. Does it hurt? She asked, nodding toward his leg. Some days more than others. Weather is turning, so it aches. He accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. I am used to it. My mother used to make a liniment for my father's back. I could try to make some if you would like. I would appreciate that. He was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think you could be happy here? Not just safe, but happy? She considered the question carefully. I think so. I am beginning to believe I could be. Good. He smiled, and it was the soft, genuine smile that she was learning to love. Because I want you to be happy. You deserve that. So do you. Maybe we can manage it together. She leaned against his shoulder just a little and felt him go still. Then, slowly, he wrapped an arm around her, holding her carefully like she was something precious. They sat like that until the stars came out, not talking, just being together, and it was the most peace Penelope had known in years. The first time they kissed was an accident. Penelope was standing on a chair trying to hang a picture frame, and the chair wobbled. Zachary caught her before she could fall, his hands strong around her waist, and she ended up pressed against his chest with her hands on his shoulders. They froze like that, faces inches apart, and she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Sorry, he said, but he did not let go. Do not be, she whispered, and then somehow her lips were on his. It was soft and tentative, a question more than a statement, and he answered by pulling her closer. His mouth was warm, and he kissed her like she was something he had been waiting for his whole life, gentle and reverent. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. I have been wanting to do that for weeks, he admitted. Then why did you not? I wanted you to be ready, wanted you to want it too. His hands were still on her waist, thumbs moving in small circles. Did you want it? Yes. She kissed him again, longer this time, and felt him smile against her mouth. That night he asked if he could move his things into her room, and she said yes. They undressed separately, shy as newlyweds despite the weeks they had been married, and when they finally lay down together in the dark, he just held her. His body was warm and solid against her back, his arm around her waist, and she felt safe in a way she had not known was possible. Is this all right? He asked, his breath warm against her neck. Yes. She laced her fingers through his. This is perfect. They made love for the first time a week later, and it was nothing like what Penelope had known with Gerald. Zachary was patient and attentive, asking what she liked, moving slowly, making sure she was with him every step of the way. Afterward, he held her close and stroked her hair, and she cried again, but this time from relief and joy and the overwhelming sweetness of being cherished. Thank you, she whispered against his chest. For what? For being kind, for being patient, for being you. He kissed her forehead. Thank you for giving me a chance, for trusting me. I do trust you. And saying it, she realized it was true. The ranch kept them busy through the fall. The cattle needed to be moved to winter pasture, and Zachary spent long days in the saddle despite the pain in his leg. Penelope threw herself into preparing the house for winter. preserving vegetables from the garden patch she had coaxed to life, sewing warmer clothes, making sure there was enough firewood stacked against the side of the house. The work was hard but satisfying, and she fell into bed, each night exhausted and content. The ranch hands began to include her in their world too. There was Jose, a vaquero in his 50s who taught her how to make proper tortillas, and young Billy, barely 20, who blushed whenever she spoke to him. The cook, a grizzled man named Pete, shared his recipe for sourdough bread and told her stories about following cattle drives in his younger days. They all treated her with respect, tipping their hats when they passed her, thanking her when she brought water out to the fields. It was so different from Boston, where Gerald's friends had looked through her like she was furniture, where his family had blamed her for his drinking. In November, a letter arrived from Gerald's brother. Penelope stared at it for a long time before opening it, her hands shaking. But when she finally tore the envelope open, it was just a brief note saying that Gerald's affairs had been settled, and there was a small sum of money coming to her as his widow. The money arrived 2 weeks later, enough to buy a dozen good horses or a small herd of cattle. "What do you want to do with it?" Zachary asked when she showed him the bank draft. "I want to invest it in the ranch, make it ours, not just yours." His eyes went bright. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. This is my home now. I want to help build it." They used the money to buy breeding stock, good horses with strong lines. Zachary had dreams of raising horses alongside the cattle, and Penelope threw herself into learning everything she could about bloodlines and training. By spring, they had a dozen new foals wobbling around the corrals, and Penelope spent hours watching them, marveling at their long legs and soft eyes. The seasons turned. Winter brought cold nights where they huddled together under heavy quilts, and Zachary told her stories about growing up in Texas, about his mother who had died when he was 12, about his brother who had moved to California to try his luck in the gold fields. Spring brought wildflowers that carpeted the desert in improbable shades of purple and gold, and Zachary picked her bouquets that made her laugh and kiss him in the middle of the yard, not caring if the ranch hands saw. Summer brought the cattle drive, and Zachary was gone for 6 weeks, moving the herd north to the railhead. Penelope missed him with an intensity that surprised her, and when he finally rode back into the yard, dusty and exhausted and grinning, she ran out to meet him. He dismounted and caught her up in his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and held him tight. "I missed you," he said into her hair. "I missed you too, so much." That night, they made love with a desperate sweetness, relearning each other after the separation, and afterward he told her about the drive, about the river crossings and the storms and the endless dust. She told him about the ranch, about the new foal that had been born while he was gone, about the vegetable garden that was producing more than she knew what to do with. They talked until dawn, tangled together in the sheets, and Penelope thought that this right here, was what happiness felt like. It was in late summer of their second year together that Penelope realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not been sure until the morning she got sick for the 3rd day in a row. She sat on the floor of the bedroom and pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling a complicated mix of joy and terror. Zachary found her there and dropped to his knees beside her. "What is wrong? Are you all right?" "I am pregnant." He went very still. Then a smile broke across his face like sunrise, bright and wonderful and full of hope. "Truly, truly." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, and she felt his shoulders shake. When he finally pulled back, there were tears on his face. "I am going to be a father. Are you happy?" "Happy, Penelope, I am." He shook his head, laughing. "I do not have words for what I am. Terrified, maybe, grateful, so damn grateful. The pregnancy was not easy." The heat made her sick, and she spent much of the fall lying down in the cool of the house, sipping water and trying not to vomit. Zachary was endlessly patient, bringing her cold cloths, making her bland meals she could keep down, sitting with her in the evenings and reading aloud from the newspapers he brought back from town. He rubbed her feet when they swelled and held her hair back when she got sick and never once complained about the disruption to their life. "I am sorry," she said one evening in December, feeling useless and huge. "For what?" He looked genuinely confused. "For being like this. For not being able to do more. Penelope, you are growing our child. That is not nothing. That is everything." He put a hand on her swollen belly, and his face softened when the baby kicked against his palm. "You are the strongest person I know." Their son was born on a freezing February night in 1884, and it was the longest night of Zachary's life. The midwife shooed him out of the room, and he paced the main room for hours, listening to Penelope cry out and wishing desperately that he could take the pain from her. When the baby finally gave his first wailing cry, Zachary sank into a chair and put his face in his hands. The midwife came out an hour later, smiling. "You can go in now. You have a healthy son." Zachary found Penelope propped up in bed, exhausted and sweaty and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. In her arms was a tiny bundle, red-faced and squalling. "Come meet your son," she said softly. He sat down carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby. The infant had a shock of dark hair and eyes that were still that newborn blue, and when Zachary reached out to touch his tiny hand, the baby gripped his finger with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Zachary whispered. "He is ours." Penelope leaned her head against his shoulder. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months, going back and forth, never quite settling. But looking at his son's face, Zachary knew. "Matthew, after my father, Matthew Yates." Penelope smiled. "I like that." The baby changed everything. Suddenly their days revolved around feeding schedules and diaper changes and the desperate need for sleep. Penelope was exhausted but radiant, and Zachary found himself waking in the night just to watch her nurse their son, the moonlight turning them both silver. He helped however he could, walking the baby when he fussed, changing diapers, singing off key lullabies that made Penelope laugh. "You are a good father," she told him one evening, watching him rock Matthew to sleep. "I am trying to be. You are." She came to stand beside him, looking down at their son. "He is lucky to have you. We both are." As Matthew grew, the ranch thrived. The horse breeding program proved successful, and Zachary was able to hire 2 more hands. They added on to the house, building a proper nursery for Matthew and a larger kitchen for Penelope. She planted more gardens, experimenting with different crops, and discovered she had a talent for growing things in the harsh desert soil. Matthew's first word was "da," and Zachary cried. His first steps were on the porch, and he fell and skinned his knee, and Penelope kissed it better while Zachary hovered anxiously. They took him to town for the 4th of July celebration when he was 18 months old, and he was fascinated by the fireworks, pointing at the sky and laughing with delight. Life was not perfect. There were hard years when the cattle prices dropped and they had to tighten their belts. There was the summer when disease swept through the herd and they lost a quarter of their stock. There were days when Zachary's leg hurt so bad he could barely walk, and days when Penelope woke from nightmares about Gerald, her heart racing, but they faced it together. When money was tight, they made do. When Zachary hurt, Penelope rubbed liniment into his leg and held him until the pain eased. When Penelope had nightmares, Zachary woke her gently and reminded her she was safe, that Gerald was gone, that she never had to be afraid again. And slowly, year by year, the nightmares came less often. When Matthew was 3, Penelope realized she was pregnant again. This time she was less scared, more confident. The pregnancy was easier, and their daughter was born on a warm May evening in 1887, small and perfect and already frowning like she was suspicious of the world. "She looks just like you," Zachary said, cradling her carefully. "Poor thing." But Penelope was smiling. They named her Rose, and she was a force of nature from the start. Where Matthew had been a calm baby, Rose was all fire and determination. She learned to walk at 9 months and immediately started trying to climb everything in sight. She followed her older brother everywhere, toddling after him with fierce concentration. And Matthew, patient and gentle even at 3, would hold her hand and help her over obstacles. Watching them together made Penelope's heart swell so much it hurt. This life, these children, this man who had taken a chance on a broken woman from Boston and helped her heal, it was more than she had ever dreamed possible. The ranch continued to grow. By the time Matthew was 5 and Rose was 2, they had over 500 head of cattle and a respected horse breeding program. Zachary had established a reputation for fair dealing and good stock, and buyers came from as far as El Paso to look at his horses. Penelope had turned her garden into a small enterprise, selling vegetables and preserves in town, and the money she made was hers to do with as she pleased. They had become part of the community too. Zachary served on the town council, helping to make decisions about water rights and property disputes. Penelope joined the church ladies' auxiliary and taught Sunday school. They hosted barbecues for the ranch hands and their families, and the house was often full of laughter and music and the smell of good food. One evening in the fall of 1889, they sat on the porch watching the sunset while the children played in the yard. Matthew was 7 now, tall for his age with his father's dark eyes and serious demeanor. Rose was 4, small and fierce with her mother's determined chin. They were building something with sticks and rocks, their heads bent together in concentration. "Do you remember when I first got off that train?" Penelope asked, leaning against Zachary's shoulder. "Every detail. You looked terrified and brave at the same time. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." His arm came around her. "I also thought you might get back on the train and leave. I almost did. If you had been any other kind of man, I would have. I am glad I am the kind of man you could stay for." She tilted her face up to kiss him, sweet and familiar. "So am I. You saved my life, you know." "No." He shook his head. "You saved your own life. I just gave you a safe place to land. You gave me more than that. You gave me a home, a family, a future." She looked at their children, at the ranch spread out before them, at the life they had built together. "You gave me everything." "You gave me everything too. I was lonely before you came. I had the ranch, had a purpose, but I was lonely. You changed that. You made this place a home instead of just a house. You made me a husband and a father. You made me whole." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Inside the house, dinner was waiting, and after they ate, there would be baths and bedtime stories and the comfortable routine of family life. Tomorrow, Zachary would ride out to check on the herds and Penelope would work in the garden and the children would play and learn and grow. It was an ordinary life, unremarkable to anyone looking from the outside. But to Penelope, it was extraordinary. She had come west expecting nothing more than safety, a legal marriage to protect her from questions, a roof over her head. Instead, she had found love, real and deep and lasting. She had found a man who valued gentleness over strength, who understood that power was not about control but about protection. She had found herself again, the woman she had been before Gerald tried to break her. Matthew called out, wanting them to come see what he and Rose had built. Zachary stood and offered Penelope his hand, pulling her to her feet. Together they walked down into the yard, and Matthew proudly showed them the elaborate structure he had created, a ranch complete with stick corrals and rock cattle. "It is just like ours," he said, beaming. "Better," Zachary said seriously. "This is the finest stick ranch I have ever seen." Rose tugged on Penelope's skirt. "I helped. I can see that. You did a wonderful job." Penelope scooped her daughter up and kissed her cheek, breathing in the scent of dust and sunshine that always clung to her children. They stood there in the yard as the light faded, the 4 of them together, and Penelope thought about the journey that had brought her here. The pain and fear, yes, but also the courage it had taken to leave, to start over, to trust again. She thought about the man beside her, the one who had seen her bruises and offered safety without judgment, who had given her time and space to heal, who had proven day after day that not all men were like Gerald. "I love you," she said, looking at Zachary. I love you too." He smiled, that soft smile she had fallen in love with. Always. The years continued to pass in that way, seasons turning, children growing. Matthew became tall and serious like his father, interested in the ranch, learning everything Zachary could teach him about cattle and horses, and the business of running a spread. Rose grew into a whirlwind of energy, more interested in climbing trees and racing her horse than in the domestic arts, much to Penelope's amused exasperation. When Matthew turned 12, Zachary gave him his first real responsibility, putting him in charge of a small herd of young horses. The boy took to it with quiet dedication, spending hours training and caring for the animals. Penelope watched her son work and saw echoes of his father in every movement, the same patience, the same gentleness. "He is going to be a good man," she told Zachary one night. "Like his mother is a good woman. He learned from watching you too, you know, the way you care for things, the way you never give up." In 1895, when Matthew was 13 and Rose was 10, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. The news came as a surprise. She had thought she was too old for more children at 36. But the midwife confirmed it, and when Penelope told Zachary, he laughed and picked her up and spun her around despite his bad leg protesting. "We are going to have our hands full," he said. When have we not had our hands full? This pregnancy was harder than the others had been. Penelope was tired all the time, and her body ached in ways it had not before. Zachary worried, hovering over her, and even the children tiptoed around her, trying to help. But in late February of 1896, their second son was born, healthy and loud and perfect. They named him Thomas, and he was doted on by everyone. Matthew, at 13, was surprisingly good with his baby brother, patient and careful. Rose, 10 and still fierce, appointed herself the baby's protector and glared at anyone who came too close. The ranch was in its best years then. They had over 1,000 head of cattle and a horse breeding program that was known throughout Texas. Zachary had bought more land, expanding the ranch to over 5,000 acres. The house had been added onto twice, and it sprawled comfortably, full of life and laughter and the chaos of children. Penelope looked at her life sometimes and could barely reconcile it with where she had started. The frightened woman who had gotten off the train in Presidio 14 years ago felt like a stranger, someone she had known once but barely recognized now. She had built a new life here in the desert, had found strength she had not known she possessed. More than that, she had found joy, the simple daily joy of living with people she loved and who loved her back. There were still hard days. Sometimes she would hear a door slam and would flinch before she could stop herself. Sometimes she would see a man raise his hand in anger in town and would have to leave, her heart racing. But those moments came less and less often, and Zachary was always there to ground her, to remind her she was safe. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Zachary took her into town for dinner at the hotel, leaving the children with Jose and his wife. It was rare for them to be alone together, and Penelope dressed with care in a new blue dress she had made, pinning up her hair with silver combs Zachary had given her for Christmas. "You are stunning," he said when he saw her, and the wonder in his voice made her blush like a girl. They ate steak and drank wine, and Zachary told her about his plans to expand the horse operation even further. Penelope told him about the letter she had received from a woman's magazine in Denver, wanting to feature her garden and preserving techniques. They talked about the children, about Matthew's quiet competence and Rose's wild spirit and baby Thomas's infectious laughter. 15 years, Zachary said as they walked back to the wagon under a sky full of stars. Sometimes it feels like we just met. Other times it feels like I have known you my whole life. I feel the same way. She leaned against him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and soap. I never thought I could be this happy, never thought I deserved it. You deserve everything good in this world. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands framing her face. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Penelope Yates. I want you to know that. I want you to never doubt it. I do not doubt it, not anymore. She kissed him there in the middle of the street, not caring who might see, pouring 15 years of gratitude and love into it. They made love that night with the same passion they had always had, tempered now by familiarity and deep affection. Afterward, lying tangled together in the dark, Penelope traced the scar through Zachary's eyebrow. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if you had not sent for a mail-order bride?" she asked. "All the time. I would probably still be alone, eating burned beans and sleeping in a house that felt empty even when I was in it." He caught her hand and kissed her palm. "What about you? Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had stayed in Boston?" "Sometimes. But I do not think I would have survived it. Not really. Gerald's ghost would have haunted me forever." She shuddered, and his arms tightened around her. "Coming here, coming to you, it saved me. It let me become who I was supposed to be. I am glad. So damn glad." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I promise I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that train ticket. I already know I will not." The children grew and the ranch prospered and the years rolled on. Matthew married at 20, a sweet girl named Sarah from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the northern edge of the property. Their first child, a daughter, was born a year later, and Penelope held her granddaughter and marveled at the passage of time. Rose proved harder to marry off, too independent and fierce for most of the local boys. She was more interested in working the ranch than in finding a husband, and Zachary let her, teaching her everything he knew about running the operation. When she finally did marry at 25, it was to a horse trainer from California who could match her spirit, and their wedding was a loud, joyful celebration that lasted 3 days. Thomas, the baby, grew into a quiet boy with a gift for numbers. He went away to school in Austin when he was 16, studying business, and when he came back, he took over the financial management of the ranch, modernizing their bookkeeping and finding new markets for their cattle and horses. By 1910, Zachary and Penelope had been married for 28 years. Zachary was 60, his dark hair gone silver, his bad leg aching more often now. Penelope was 51, her face lined but still beautiful, her hands rough from years of work. They had 6 grandchildren and another on the way, and the ranch was now run by their children, though Zachary still rode out most days to check on things. They sat on the porch one evening in late summer, watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before. Zachary's hand found Penelope's, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How grateful I am for all of this, for you." She squeezed his hand. "I was so broken when I came here, so afraid, and you were so patient with me, so kind. You let me heal in my own time. You never pushed, never demanded, you just loved me. It was easy to love you, easiest thing I ever did." He smiled at her, and it was the same smile that had captured her heart 28 years ago, soft and genuine and full of warmth. "You were worth every moment of patience. You are still worth everything. Do you remember what you said to me when you saw the bruises? I said I would never raise a hand to you, and you never did, not once. Not even when I was difficult or scared or pushing you away." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were good tears, clean. "You kept your promise. Every single day you kept it. That was not hard either. I meant it then and I mean it now. You are precious to me, Penelope. You always have been." He wiped her tears away with his thumb. "No more crying. We are supposed to be celebrating. Celebrating what? Being alive, being together, being happy." He stood and offered his hand, the gesture as familiar as breathing. "Dance with me. There is no music. We will make our own." So they danced there on the porch in the fading light, swaying together to a melody only they could hear. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their family, Matthew and Sarah visiting with the grandchildren, Rose and her husband arguing cheerfully about something, Thomas working on the books. It was the sound of life, messy and loud and perfect. When the dance ended, Zachary kissed her, sweet and lingering. "I love you, Penelope Yates, today, tomorrow, forever. I love you too, Zachary Yates, always. They stood there on the porch as the stars came out, two people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had built a life and a family and a legacy together. Penelope thought about the girl she had been, desperate and hurting and so very alone. That girl would not believe this future if she could see it, would not believe that such happiness was possible, but it was possible. It was real. It was hers. Years continued to pass, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. There were weddings and births and inevitably deaths. Jose passed away in his sleep at 78, and they buried him in the small cemetery on the ranch, the whole community turning out to honor a man who had been part of their family for decades. Pete the cook followed a year later, and Billy, not so young anymore, took over the bunkhouse kitchen with his wife. Zachary's bad leg got worse as the years went on, until some days he could not walk without a cane. Penelope's hands developed arthritis, making the fine needlework she loved difficult. They were growing old together, and there was a bittersweet beauty in it, in watching each other's bodies fail even as their love remained strong. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1922, their children threw them a celebration at the ranch. Over 100 people came, neighbors and friends and family, filling the house and yard with noise and laughter. There was a band and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. Matthew gave a toast, talking about his parents' example of love and partnership. Rose, never one for public speaking, just hugged them both fiercely. Thomas presented them with a leather-bound book he had commissioned, a history of the ranch written and illustrated by his wife. Penelope stood in the middle of the chaos and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. She was 63 years old, her hair was white, her body was worn, but she was surrounded by people who loved her, by the family she had helped create, by the legacy she and Zachary had built together. "Are you all right?" Zachary asked, coming up beside her. "I am perfect, absolutely perfect." She took his hand. "Thank you for giving me this life. Thank you for sharing it with me." They lived 5 more years together, 5 years of quiet contentment. They spent their days on the porch, watching the ranch operate around them, secure in the knowledge that their children and grandchildren would carry on what they had built. They read books and told each other stories, and made love when Zachary's leg and Penelope's arthritis allowed, still finding joy in each other's bodies even after 45 years of marriage. Zachary died in his sleep on a cold January night in 1927, his hand in Penelope's. He was 77 years old, and he went peacefully the way he had lived. Penelope woke to find him gone, and the grief was staggering, a physical weight that pressed on her chest. But alongside the grief was gratitude, deep and abiding for the life they had shared, for the love that had sustained her for so long. She lived another 3 years without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The ranch continued to thrive under Matthew's management, and Penelope spent her days in the garden or on the porch, often with a child or grandchild beside her, telling stories about the early days, about the grandfather they had loved, about the life she and Zachary had built from nothing but hope and kindness. On a warm spring evening in 1930, Penelope Yates passed away in her sleep at the age of 71. They buried her beside Zachary in the ranch cemetery, under a cottonwood tree they had planted together 40 years earlier. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered around the grave, and Rose, now 53 and gray-haired herself, told the story one more time. She told them about a young woman who had stepped off a train in Presidio in 1882, frightened and bruised and looking for nothing more than safety. She told them about a cowboy who had offered her exactly that, who had proven day after day that gentleness was a strength, not a weakness. She told them about a love story that had started with a promise, a simple statement that had become a foundation. "Then let me be the one who never raises a hand." They built all of this, Rose said, gesturing to the ranch spread out around them, to the house and the barns and the cattle grazing in the distance. But more than that, they built a family. They showed us what love should look like, what marriage should be. They showed us that broken things can heal, that happiness is possible even after the worst pain. That is their legacy. That is what they gave us. And as the sun set over the Texas desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, 3 generations of the family Penelope and Zachary had created stood together, bound by blood and love, and the example of 2 people who had found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful. The ranch still stands today, run by the great-great-grandchildren of Zachary and Penelope Yates, and if you visit it on a warm evening, you might see a couple sitting on the porch, watching the sunset with their hands clasped together. The faces change, but the love remains, a testament to the power of kindness, patience, and the courage to trust again. The story of the mail-order bride who hid her bruises and the cowboy who promised to never raise a hand has become a family legend, passed down through generations. A reminder that even in the roughest country, gentleness can flourish, and love can heal the deepest wounds.